Strange things are happening all over the state of Oklahoma, and specifically the Chickasaw National Park. Tonight, I bring you 5 bizarre and terrifying first-hand accounts from park rangers and campers alike who have experienced supernatural things. But before we get into today's episode, you should go ahead and slap that subscribe button because I release storytelling of the mysterious and supernatural. Let's go. Our first encounter story is by a man by the name of Teddy, a volunteer park ranger, outdoor survivalist, and avid recreational hiker. This was not a sighting of some wild beast that's a conjured work of art of the imagination. What they saw this day was in fact real, or so they claim. Now, Teddy was patrolling the National Forest area, which here borders on the Chickasaw area. Now, at the time it was late fall in the Chickasaw National Reserve. Teddy was on patrol in the early evening time, and they had just come out of a small forested section and was about to go up a small hill. The area is heavily wooded with hickory, oak, cedar, elm trees, thick underbrush, and lots of low-lying areas, which sometimes will hold water for spring runoffs or rainstorms. As Teddy began driving, something had caught his eye at the top, where the woods meet a clearing that goes back into an old field that is now overgrown. It looked to be like a large man standing there, but as soon as he'd got close enough for him to see it in full view, this figure sprinted off in the woods towards one side and ultimately disappeared into the brush. Now, he claims this thing never made any sound while running, and he can't overestimate just how big this person was. He claimed that it stood at least 7 to 8 feet tall, wide, broad shoulders, and he could get a pretty good look at the outline, the arms, etc. He never looked or turned in his direction, but he had to try and stop his vehicle and kind of double take and register what he was looking at. He estimated that its weight would be well over 400 pounds, comparing it to that of another person or an animal. The distance was roughly 80 or so yards, and is not an overestimate either, considering the clarity of the sighting that he had had. Now, the whole year, this particular spot was always kind of spooky to walk back into, just because of how thick and overgrown and dark it was in there. And it kind of separated it from the sun-bleached meadow portion of the forest and made it impossible to really go far back at all. Now, immediately after the sighting, Teddy tried rationalizing and writing it off as just a huge man. However, the circumstances surrounding this sighting just didn't make a lot of sense to him. Now, I'm not one to quickly point fingers and say it was something supernatural or even a Bigfoot. The fact that this person was in such thick brush and apparently wearing all black while being able to move extremely quickly through the brush just does not sit right with me or Teddy. Teddy has been back there himself many times, and the brush is extremely thick. In fact, it's so thick that you can't just easily up and run through it. He had the chance to go back there himself several times to look for any signs of anything suspicious. Now, it's hard to tell if any tracks could be back there, but he claimed that it did look like something of substantial size was actually bedding down further back. However, that could easily be attributed to the deers or other wild animal in the area. So there is nothing truly conclusive, at least none that he could find. When Teddy had the chance to speak to a close friend who is retired, he's had several run-ins with what he believes to be Bigfoot in the same National Reserve. Since he is full Chickasaw, he and his people have many stories of what they thought to be Bigfoot all around the same area. Part of this reserve is supposedly Bigfoot territory, or so Teddy is told, and that's why there is a higher percentage of sightings being reported all around. And that could correlate with what he had in his own run-in. Now, his friend, who he spoke of, told Teddy that even the elders back then would talk about what they called as a black fox kind of creature, which is separate from the creature that Teddy described. The beast, they explained, was taller than a man and was kind of a guardian of the forest, so to speak. It had a head that was similar to a fox with more canine origins. This creature could be malevolent at times and potentially even dangerous. The Chickasaw people, he's told, have an actual word for this creature, but he was never told. He's not trying to stray away from the sighting, but he thinks that the anecdote is fascinating to say the least, and coincides with many of the other supposed sightings in the same area. Taking into account everything, does this make Teddy a believer? He's not sure, but it definitely opens up the realm of possibilities. So the question goes, what exactly did Teddy see? And what is this black fox creature that the Chickasaw people speak of? Could they potentially be talking about a dogman or perhaps a creature of mythology? I'll let you be the judge. The following story, submitted by the name SIDNEY. They have a story that will blow all of us away. Now, they haven't shared this with many people, and due to the sensitive nature of the details in the story, it's not something they're exactly comfortable sharing. However, due to my platform, apparently they feel safe enough to share it anonymously. Now, for some quick background information, SIDNEY's 35 and has worked in the parks and recreation for almost 7 years. This story's events occurred back in 2013 in the same area as the last story with Teddy, the Chickasaw National Reserve in Oklahoma State. Here's the story. So, SIDNEY was working for the Bureau of Land Management, in charge of monitoring and enforcing safety regulations on employees working on federal government land. They specifically were in charge of one site in an area of old-growth forest, roughly about an hour away from their cabin. Now, their family had moved out to work these sites for 3 months at a time, and they had already been there for the past 2, keeping the sites safe and steadily driving between each to ensure everything was going as planned. Now, their tasks were simple. Mostly road maintenance and repairs to existing buildings and structures. Pretty mundane, boring stuff, really. Nobody was really looking forward to their third and final month there, but with the paychecks they got, who in their right mind would be? One day, SIDNEY was informed by her higher-ups that there was some tasks to be changed. They had one road within the sites in particular that was known to have frequent incidences of feral hogs causing damage. They were essentially everywhere in the area due to an overabundant amount of food. So, they had asked SIDNEY to go in and kind of help take care of the area a bit. Of course, all this extra work kind of fell into SIDNEY's and coworkers' lap, so it was just the cherry on top of all their normal work. Great, right? Well, she slowly began to put the pieces together, but being out in the middle of a national park, she had brushed any distressing thoughts aside and worked as usual. Well, the feral hogs were abundant along the said road for sure. Each morning, she would drive down an en route to the final sites and check at the first site to make sure all was good. Not so much. There was this overwhelming dread and something so uncomfortably off about the place. Everything was fine throughout most nights, though, in the camp. But then in the early morning hours, SIDNEY began to notice a huge influx of dead, torn-apart hogs off the path. Even the coyotes on one side of the campsite began howling like crazy, as if in complete distress. It was not a kill howl. Things like this kept happening day after day. The dogs would constantly act up at night and refuse to stay outside. Weird things were going on, but SIDNEY was trying not to piece everything together. Now, fast forward a couple more days, and just so everybody is aware, this was the third and final month of work there. They're getting continuously antsy, ready to be done with their time in the forest. Their tasks were around the same routine every day, day after day. Now, the dead feral hog situation continued to build up, and it looked vicious. Evidently, this had now become a feeding ground for what SIDNEY assumed at the time was coyote food. However, she never considered the nervous howling and yipping that would occur at night. She should state here that she's heard how coyotes sound when they make a kill and the noises they make. She's also heard how coyotes are when they are in complete distress, and this is exactly what it sounded like. The thoughts of some alpha predator being in the woods at the time never really occurred to her, and if they did, they would have assumed it likely be a black bear. Nothing would have prepared her for what was to come. On one of the final days back at the cabin, after it had already grown dark, her and a coworker were sitting on the porch just chewing fat with each other, looking out towards the old growth trees, and thought that she saw a bright green mad glow shimmer and quickly disappear. She interrupted the conversation with her coworker and pointing into the old growth, asking him if he had saw that. He replied no, he had not, and seemed very annoyed that SIDNEY had interrupted him. Surely but slowly, they got back into conversation when she again saw a small flickering of lights. They were multicolored lights, kind of like LEDs, but they were different. And this time, the coworker saw it as well. They both thought about going out there to investigate, but they wanted to watch further, figuring somebody was simply out there in the old growth. There were also no campsites around this exact location, at least not for several more miles. The odds of somebody being out here are slim, and the question is, why? They both instantly heard this loud banging sound, that reminded SIDNEY and coworker of sheet metal being shot at with bullets. It was very loud and made both of them very uncomfortable. And within seconds right after, they began hearing movement all through the old growth, the same direction they were looking. And what her coworker and her initially thought were just people messing around back there would soon prove to be something else entirely. As the seconds dragged on, the sound of movement would become much clearer, and they could make out that it was actually two distinct figures moving in the brush. Whatever they were, they sounded very heavy and large, and this is due to the amount of foliage being stomped on and large branches being snapped. Whoever or whatever was out there was not at all concerned about staying stealthy or trying to conceal their location. At this point, red flags are just firing off in her gut, and for the worst part, she has no idea what's about to happen. As soon as it began, everything just seemed to die and stop suddenly. Whatever these two figures were seemed to stop right at the tree line of the old growth. Because it was dark out and they had minimal light, they could barely make out anything past the old growth, which was in perfect view of the porch they were on. Now, her coworker began panicking and went to turn the porch light off because it felt like one of those situations they were in where they were completely illuminated and exposed. In hindsight, she's not exactly sure what her coworker sought to achieve by turning off the porch light, but it's what happened. Now, the second the light went off and darkness enshrouded everything, she described it something like a horse or something deeper, making these grunting, groaning noises, as they could hear one of the figures was moving off around to the left side, going deeper off into the brush. The other one was staying put, and as her and her coworker looked closer, they can now see what clearly resembled eye shine. Do you know what it's like when you shine headlights into the eyes of a deer? They almost illuminate this kind of golden glow. And that's close to what SIDNEY and coworker saw, except the eyes were a gleaming crimson red. SIDNEY can't exactly speak for her coworker who was there with her, but she will say in that moment, she's never felt primal fear like that at all in her life. And within seconds, but feeling like hours, letting out noises to let her know that it was somehow completely dissatisfied with the situation. And at that point, began slowly backing away into the darkness where it could be no longer seen. She doesn't understand how any eye shine could be possible. The eye shine was not originally even seen until the porch light was off. So she's unsure if it did not get close enough to the tree line until they turned it off, or maybe it just wasn't visible with the light on. After it backed off, they both ran into the cabin completely terrified and waited. The night itself remained silent and stayed that way the rest of the evening. She wished she could say that the rest of that night was eventful, but it wasn't. She was anxious to leave the following morning, but her camping schedule had to keep her out till dark. So seeing that light was so odd that she's unsure how to describe it. She's told that the feral hog problem slowly began to taper off and that they were finding more dead ones in droves. Many of them looked like a large canine had partially eaten them. She's not exactly sure if there's some coincidence between what her coworker and her saw and the nervous, stressed howling of the coyotes at night. She's not here to claim that what she saw was anything specific because she simply doesn't know. She can tell you, though, that she was beyond terrified and that she will testify that it was not a bear or any typical animal. Now, what's really interesting about this story is right before the encounter, the eyewitness describes seeing strange, colorful lights that are commonly attributed to UFOs. For those that don't know, there are many cases from eyewitness stories that detail seeing strange lights in the sky or UFO-like crafts before having an encounter of some kind. This would allude to the fact that there is indeed a connection between the two. The real question here is, what sort of creature or being was right near the cabin that night, and what was its intentions? In the spring of 2014, a man by the name of Lee had decided to make a solo camping trip in the Keystone State Park in Oklahoma. This is where they had an experience they can't quite grasp. They've been an avid outdoorsman for as long as they can remember, so it's not exactly an unfamiliar setting, but this episode still left him with his skin crawling, even to the next day. Now, he had been hiking roughly for about an hour and a half, maybe two. He kept losing track of time because it was so incredibly beautiful. The trees were thick, but the trail cut through them, so you could see many open skies and the sunlight shining down on everything. It was also very quiet, which is something he loves about the outdoors. There were no cars or planes or anything like that to ruin the sound pollution experience. As he hiked along, his mind began wandering as often as it does when you're alone, and then suddenly, this feeling hit him like a ton of bricks. It felt like somebody just punched him right in the gut, and all the hair stood up on end and every muscle began to tense all at once. Instinctively, he stopped dead in his tracks and looked around trying to figure out what happened, but nothing seemed amiss except for one thing. This overwhelming sense of dread came over him from nowhere, like some evil malicious presence had entered the world without any warning whatsoever. And as soon as these feelings overcame him, which seemed to last for minutes, they immediately would subside, leaving behind this eerie silence throughout the forest, as if everything and everyone had just transpired. After these initial feelings had passed, nothing else really happened until later, after dark, when things began to get downright weird. Already, he felt like he was being watched. Now, before going into detail about what occurred during the dark, here are some other details worth mentioning. The weather conditions were perfect and sunny and warm, so not much wind blowing at all, and visibility was excellent since there wasn't any fog. No mosquitoes, and there were wildlife sightings including deer and droppings throughout the entire hike, which means that this was a very active area. Lots of animal noises too, so that means there wasn't an alpha predator in the area, hopefully. So now, fast forward to the night, and Lee is lying in his sleeping bag listening to the sounds of nature around him, and he hears many things, but nothing out of the ordinary until later. All at once, he began hearing this very loud crashing sound coming from somewhere in the distance. It began to sound like a tree had fallen and was being broken up by something. This noise continued for about 5 or so minutes before abruptly stopping without any other sounds afterward, except for the call of distant coyotes howling off in another direction. The thing that got his attention, though, is that after those noises had ceased, everything went completely silent. No animals were making noise, no crickets, nothing. No wind even blew through the tent to sway things back and forth. Everything was deathly quiet. And even though there should have at least been some night ambient noises, it wasn't. Nothing moved anywhere near him either during this period, and everything began to feel so eerie, especially when you're camping alone like he was. So whatever caused that commotion simply didn't want anything to do with anyone. Whether it was a Bigfoot or not is irrelevant because Lee and it both knew that each other were there and based on his previous experiences was just trying to respect its space. Lee was trying his best not to get caught off guard in hopes that something wouldn't happen because Lee was convinced that whatever was out there had actually uprooted and ripped out a tree and was breaking it up, or so that's how he described it. Is it possible that what Lee encountered out there, or at least heard, was potentially a Bigfoot? And while Lee didn't actually see anything, hearing those sounds can be quite frightening. And then, of course, you have all the noises just completely ceasing, which is terrifying in and of itself. And after reading countless Bigfoot stories, this one almost reminds me of the Bigfoot who's trying to let everyone know that this is his territory and to try and spook people off of it. Just a theory, of course, but the details are consistent with stories that are similar to that area and all. So what do you think he experienced? This fourth story comes from a guy who calls himself FREDRIK. And he's writing this report because of a recent encounter with what appeared to be some kind of winged human-like creature. This occurred at the Fort Supply Lake National Recreational Area, which is located in Oklahoma. This happened on June 14th, 2019 at around 11 p.m. He was camping with his girlfriend and her family at the time, and they're staying in a large group of campsites that are on the south side of the lake and very close to a large highway. Now, according to FREDRIK, this area in particular has been known for many Bigfoot sightings over several decades now, at least according to his family. And so he's sitting around the campfire with his girlfriend and her family, and they heard what sounded like something big moving in the sky about roughly a couple hundred yards away. Although because it was dark, they couldn't really see anything, and they did not have any flashlights strong enough to shine up into the sky to see what it could have been, but he said he'd heard the sounds of large wings flapping. But when he tried to look around, couldn't find anything. So he kind of just blew it off and just thought it was strange. After not thinking much more about it, he began to hear these loud grunting noises, but again tried his best to just ignore it and just think it was strange. Now, fast forward almost 2 hours later, when everybody had now trotted off to bed, himself included. His girlfriend's dad had actually stayed up himself drinking beer and watching TV inside the camper trailer parked right next to the tent. FREDRIK, feeling a little cold, wanted to get up and go sit by the fire, which was still going, by the way. And so as he gets up out of his bed and out of his tent, he realizes now is the perfect time to relieve himself. So he walks over to the grassy area between both trailers where there is a lot of tall pine trees surrounding them. And he steps outside and begins taking care of business behind one of the trees, then heads back over towards the tent about 20 feet away. This is right when he's able to see this huge black creature almost appearing directly above him. Now, you might stop and say, well, wait a minute. It was dark outside at night. How did this happen? Well, FREDRIK did mention that there was moonlight out. Although how much, I'm not sure. He didn't exactly say, but there was at least some sort of illumination, as he had saw this outline of this large, half-man, half-bat is how he described it, levitating right there in the sky above him. His description of this creature is that it had leathery wings that were at least 10 feet long and also appeared to have two human-like legs. It apparently circled above him for about 30 seconds before darting off towards the direction of the lake. He even watched it fly over the water until he lost sight of it. And then darkness. This is when a second one appeared from the forest, and this one looked much larger than the first. FREDRIK was completely beside himself, terrified, running back inside the tent to wake up his girlfriend, but she did not wake up. After several minutes of trying to get his girlfriend awake to tell her what had happened, she did not believe him. So he goes and runs outside, and of course could not find them anywhere. Now, this is a story he hasn't shared with many people, but he decided to with me, so again, I kind of take it with a grain of salt. It is very interesting, at least, and the flying humanoid phenomena is a very strange one. While there isn't as many creature stories like that, like there are with Bigfoot and dogman, they are still out there, and there does seem to be a heavy concentration of Mothman and flying creature beings being spotted in the Midwest and East Coast specifically. I have no idea if there truly is a connection there or what the reasoning is for that. However, I will say that it's at least interesting. Our final story today is by a man who calls himself Roger. He had been a park ranger for the U.S. Forest Service in the early 1980s and had an incident that occurred one night while driving through a state park on his way home in Oklahoma. The incident occurred midsummer of 1980 on an asphalt road that cuts through some hills. He had been driving his patrol truck for about 45 minutes after leaving work at the end of a shift. The park was pitch black other than his headlights and the high half moon overhead, and he describes feeling pretty alone as usual. He always drove fast because it just felt like something would jump out and scare him if he didn't keep up to speed with what seemed to be endless curves around sudden drops. So finally, he kind of kept speeding along until he came upon a small clearing barely 50 feet across, where two dirt paths kind of meet right at angles, and there was a large sycamore tree standing watch over both roads leading away. It was also dimly outlined by the moon. And as soon as his headlights passed directly over this spot, they illuminated two very large silhouettes standing between himself and either road. And directly behind these beasts stood another smaller, but not quite full grown, but still substantial version which appeared more like a yearling cub compared to his parent's stature. Both beasts were huge, however almost twice his height, each shoulder wide and 8 feet tall, perhaps weighing 700 pounds if not more. Both bore coal black fur covering their bodies except facial areas, revealing eyes glowing orange, with what he described as cones of yellow light emanating downward. A strong odor had emanated outward to carrying traces of decomposing meat mixed with raw sewage. He had sat there frozen behind the wheel of his truck with hands locked tightly around the steering wheel until one of these things slowly began raising its arm, holding onto a tree trunk, and then in some sort of communicative way began knocking a few times against the tree trunk, as if letting him know that these creatures were acknowledging him in some sort of rudimentary form of communication between these two sentient creatures. While trying to grasp and understand what was going on, he quickly concluded that he needed to get out of here. So he smashed his foot down on the accelerator and tore down the road at high speed. But when he turned around to look back again, they were gone. Neither was in sight or even heard while driving off into the darkness. He still can't believe what had happened to him, but keeps it to himself until years later. Now, there are many versions of dogman or Bigfoot type creatures that are well known, such as the Ohio Grassman, the Michigan Dogman, the Arkansas Sasquatch, and of course many others, but This incident happened at night in northeastern Oklahoma. This doesn't exactly sound like your typical North American Bigfoot or Sasquatch encounter, but no doubt it was potentially dogman. The smaller one perhaps a youngling, and the larger ones a father and mother. So did he truly see two large upright canine creatures this night, or was this simply a case of him being exhausted or a possible misidentification? Perhaps people in werewolf costumes maybe? I'll let you be the judge. If you guys enjoyed today's episode, be sure to go ahead and slap that like button and leave a comment down below letting me know your thoughts on today's stories. Also, if you're new to the channel, be sure to go ahead and subscribe for content just like this. As always, guys, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.